Buttercup Days by Ethel Eliot. Chapter 1. The Fairy Missionary. Anything is likely to happen in the springtime. Beth and Robin knew that, but they weren't expecting it to happen to themselves that Sunday afternoon out on the lawn, right under the parsonage windows. Beth and Robin and baby Paul were lying in the uncut grass, their chins in their hands, their faces meeting in a circle. Behind them, their father was writing at his desk in the study window, and above, on the piazza balcony, their mother was reading a book. But neither Father Denning nor Mother Denning took in what was happening, nor did they, in fact, ever seem to take it in, even after they were told about it. But that could not spoil it for the Denning children. Nothing could spoil such a jolly happening. Robin had just said, "What shall we play next?" Beth answered, "Oh, nothing for a while more. It's so nice just to soak up the sun and nibble grass." But baby Paul, for yes, it was the 3-year-old who saw the wonder first, cried, "Oh, let's play with the fairy." And he pointed with his chubby pink finger at a shaking yellow light right in the middle of the circle their noses made. Beth and Robin looked at it curiously, and the more curiously they looked, the steadier the light grew, until it wasn't a light at all, but a young boy about as tall as a blade of grass in a yellow tam-o'-shanter. And now the children realized, though they had not noticed it at the time, that the shaking light had been the yellow tam-o'-shanter. He had been waving all the while. But now it was back on his head, and he was looking at them every bit as curiously as they were looking at him. "Well," remarked Beth, who was sensible like her mother, "perhaps if we only go on looking at you hard enough, you'll turn back into a dandelion." "Not at all," said the fairy. "It was a buttercup I came through." "It's too early for buttercups," objected Robin, who was thoughtful like his father. "Yes, it is rather early for buttercups," agreed the fairy politely. "That's why I took that route. I thought I'd like coming through the very first buttercup of the summer. Rather fun." "Yes, rather fun," echoed baby Paul's deep, pleased baby voice. The way he said the rather made them all laugh. Even the fairy laughed until his yellow tam-o'-shanter fell off and got lost under a dandelion leaf. Beth, who had sharp eyes, found it for him. She even put it back on to his head with light fingers. "Whom were you waving your tam to just before we saw you?" she asked. "How'd you know I was waving it before you saw me?" laughed the fairy. Beth and Robin looked at each other, puzzled themselves as to how they had known. "Why, we just remembered," was all they could say. At that, the fairy seemed vastly pleased, He pulled off his tam-o'-shanter again and tossed it high above his head, shouting, "Hurrah! Hurrah! These are wise children." He meant it, too. "Are you a fairy?" Robin asked then, bluntly. Anyone could see that he was a fairy, but Robin always liked to make doubly sure about everything. "Why, yes," said the fairy, after a second's thought. "I suppose I am, but that isn't the important thing about me. The important thing is that I am Tim. Are you children?" "Yes, we are children," said Beth, "but it's just as with you. The important thing is that we are ourselves. The baby is Paul. That's Robin. I'm Beth." By now, Robin had another thoughtful question ready. "What do you mean by saying you came through a buttercup?" he asked. "Why, this is the way of that," began Fairy Tim, who was eager enough to explain. "It's so seldom that children can see fairies at all. We can play around right under your noses for hours and never be noticed. That's all very well, and even convenient for most fairies. They don't mind a bit. But I want to be a traveler. I can stay at home enough when I'm old. When I'm young, that's the time to see the world. And besides," he went on, "I've always wanted to be a missionary. To tell the truth, the more I have seen of you children playing in and out of the house and with your friends, the more I've known you needed a missionary to visit you. So, all in a minute, I got the idea of coming through the first buttercup. They see buttercups all night, I thought. Why not use something they can see so easily for a doorway?" "What nonsense! A missionary for us!" cried Beth, her face getting quite red. "Why, our father's a minister, and we ourselves send our pennies and our old clothes too to the missionaries to give away. We don't need a missionary." "But I'm a fairy missionary, you see," said Fairy Tim. "That's quite different. It's fairy truth I've come to teach you. Wouldn't you like to learn some of that?" "Yes, fairy truth sounds jolly," said Robin. "But what I want to know is, were you standing in the doorway of the buttercup waving your tam to us when we first saw you?" "Exactly. I was standing right in the doorway. That's what got your attention, and I kept on waving my hat till I saw I was going to keep your attention. The rest was easy." "Where's the buttercup now, then?" asked Beth, looking all about in the grass and not seeing any. "Why, if you find that, then you will have lost me, of course," said Fairy Tim. "Even a child ought to know that." "Not at all, and you needn't be rude," cried Beth, half laughing and half cross, as she reached out a hand to seize the fairy. She held him fast in her strong brown fingers. "I'll keep you tight and safe like this," she said, "till you show us the buttercup. There's no danger of losing you. Now where?" But she stopped, her mouth still open in amazement. there was no fairy Tim in her tight-shut hand at all, and just outside of it, its root firmly in the ground, a yellow buttercup blew in the breeze, the first of the summer. "Now you've done it," cried Robin, much disappointed. "Why'd you have to go grabbing like that?" Baby Paul began to cry. What baby who had suddenly lost a fairy could help it? And Beth, I am thankful to say, looked ashamed. Quietly, she opened her fingers and drew back her hand, and just as she drew back her hand, Fairy Tim came back through the doorway of the buttercup again, and stood laughing. "Don't cry, Paul," he said. "I just had to show your sister that that's not the way to keep a fairy. No use to grab, no use to clutch. That gets you nowhere with fairies or fairish things. I'll put it into a rhyme for your remembering. One thing wise fairies know. Would you hold, just let go." "I'll remember," said Beth, and then, after thinking a minute, "Oh, how easy it will be from now on to get whatever we want, if that is so." "Oh, but the rhyme isn't about just ordinary things like candy and roller skates, is it?" asked thoughtful Robin. "Of course it isn't," laughed Fairy Tim. "It's only true of fairies and fairish things. But there are lots of fairish things, even for people who can't let go enough to see the fairies themselves." "Tell us some fairish things then," said Beth. "Why, going to sleep is a fairish thing, and loving your mother, and dancing in the sunshine. Only remember the rhyme, and fairish things are the things you'll always do well." The children eyed Fairy Tim quietly now, and with respect. What a jolly, wise fairy missionary he was. Chapter 2. Sunday afternoon with Fairy Tim. "Let's take Fairy Tim over to show to the Sullivans," cried Robin. "How surprised they'll be. What fun to surprise them so." But Beth shook her head. "We are in our Sunday clothes," she said sensibly, "and you know we always get dirty playing there. They will be just in their spotty overalls, as though it weren't Sunday at all. It will be better to take him to Dolores's." "All right," agreed Robin, "but it's always more fun at the Sullivans." Then he looked rather questioningly at Tim's 4-inch legs. "Hadn't I better carry you?" he asked. "It might be hard for you to keep up with us." But Fairy Tim laughed. "From first to last, you must know." The children made him laugh a lot. "It's more likely you who can't keep up with me," he said. "Fairies are much quicker than humans in getting to places, but it will be easier for me to keep back with you if Beth will put me into her apron pocket. That will be cooler than your hand, Robin." The pocket was deep and, oddly enough, embroidered with a yellow buttercup. they started off merrily, baby Paul trailing after. But to get to Dolores's big house on the hill, they had to pass their washerwoman's, Miss Sullivan's, little house at the foot of the hill. The two red-headed little Sullivans were leaning over the rickety gate down by the road. Coming to play, they called delightedly as the children drew near. "We are on our way to Dolores's," Beth said primly, eyeing their speckly overalls and tousled heads. "Ah," began Billy Sullivan, but stopped and shrieked, "A fairy, a fairy, a fairy peeking out of her pocket. Oh, oh, a real fairy, as sure as you're alive," gasped Mary Sullivan, almost pitching forward over the gate in her sudden joy. "Stop, wait. Oh, please, won't you come in and play with us?" But Beth pulled Robin and baby Paul right on past the gate, calling back over her shoulder, "Tomorrow, perhaps. He has come to stay with us for a long time. We'll come tomorrow, perhaps." So, what was there for the Sullivan children to do but to lean, pop-eyed, over the gate and gaze longingly after the departing fairy, since their mother had forbidden them to leave the yard? Fairy Tim, for his part, leaned far out of Beth's pocket and waved both hands to the Sullivans, for they were, he could see quickly enough, children after a fairy's heart. Up at the big house on the hill, Dolores's aunt met the children at the door. Dolores was playing with her dolls in the rose garden, she said. They must wipe their feet carefully before coming through the house, and Beth had better pick baby Paul right up and carry him over the rugs, for his little feet seemed so dusty that all the wiping he might do would not mend them. But Beth was keeping her hand over the top of her pocket, with Fairy Tim's head snuggling under it. She felt, somehow, that Aunt Augusta was not quite the person to show the fairy to first. She might even bring bad luck to their plans. So Robin, guessing this quite easily, was the one to pick baby Paul up and struggle with him across all the rugs away over to the glass door leading down into the rose garden. Robin was only 6 years old, and as baby Paul was 3, and big for his age, it was not so easy, but Aunt Augusta did not offer to help. So, that's the kind of aunt she is, thought Fairy Tim in fairy scorn, peeping out through Beth's fingers. Dolores was sitting on a cushion under a rose bush. She was wearing a fluffy white dress tied around the waist with a wide blue sash. Her golden curls hung down all about her shoulders, and at the side of her head was a huge butterfly bow. That's the way fairies are supposed to look, and don't, thought Fairy Tim when he spied her. Dolores did not jump up when she saw the children, for her doll was asleep in her lap. "Don't say anything about Fairy Tim," whispered Robin as they came down the path. "Let's surprise her." Beth nodded. Dolores always greeted the dinning children, with the same words. And today was no different. "What shall we play?" she asked at once. For Beth and Robin were never at a loss for things to do, and Dolores, poor child, was at a loss most of the time. "I'm tired of this old doll," she went on, "and so I'm glad you've come." But Beth and Robin, and even baby Paul, were so full of their great surprise that for once they had nothing to say. They just stood in front of Dolores and smiled mysteriously. Then Beth took her hand from her pocket, and there was Fairy Tim, head and shoulders, laughing out. The children looked down at him, sideways out of the corners of their eyes, and then at Dolores. They expected her to jump up and shout with delight, but there was no shout of delight. Dolores merely looked back at them, wondering what all the mystery was, and then, because she was not at all a stupid child about everything, though she surely was stupid enough about fairy things, she too looked hard at Beth's pocket. "What is the matter with your pocket, anyway?" she asked. "What have you in it?" But the children did not answer. They looked at Dolores, their eyes wide with amazement. Couldn't she see what Beth had in her pocket? Then Dolores did shout, but it was not a shout of delight. It was an angry shout of fear. "Are you hiding a worm, or a snail, or a mouse, or a beetle, or a caterpillar, or a bat, or anything like that there, Beth Denning?" she cried, jumping up and letting her doll tumble to the ground. "For if you are, and you dare frighten me with it, I'll just tell my Aunt Augusta so." And all the time, Fairy Tim was there in plain daylight, laughing until his yellow tam fell off and lay at Dolores's feet, caught on a grass blade. Beth bent down and picked it up. Placing it lightly back on Fairy Tim's head, she asked, "Can't you really see what I have here, Dolores? Anybody would know it's a fairy." "No, I can't see anything. How should I see through your pocket and know what's there?" cried Dolores, getting more and more excited, while her voice rose shriller and shriller. "But if you're hiding a frog or she began again. But it was at that minute that Aunt Augusta, who had heard her niece's shouts, where she sat up in the parlor, came running to her rescue. "What are they doing to you, Dolores?" she asked, quite breathless. "What is the matter, lambkin?" Dolores pointed one stiff, shaking finger at Beth's pocket, and went on from where she had left off. "Or a snail, or a caterpillar, or a mouse, or a beetle, or a bat, or anything like that, Beth Denning, my Aunt Augusta will send you right home. So there." "What have you in your pocket, Elizabeth Dining?" Aunt Augusta was very stern. At the same time she drew her Sunday skirts back, so that they might not come too near the mysterious apron pocket. "Why, nothing," said Beth. "At least nothing that you could mind. It's only a fairy, and he's not just an ordinary fairy. He's a missionary fairy. I didn't think Dolores would be frightened of a fairy, especially a missionary one." "Oh, I don't believe it," cried Dolores. "It isn't one of her pretending games. I'm sure it's something real. Look in her pocket, and you'll see it's something real, Aunt Augusta." And that is just what Aunt Augusta did. She spread open the top of Beth's pocket with the tips of her fingers, almost knocking Fairy Tim out. All she said was, "Just a buttercup and a few leaves. For shame, a great big girl like you, Beth Dinning, to go scaring Dolores with nothing at all. Your mother will feel badly when I tell her." Now Robin suddenly exploded, for he was the first to understand. "Beth," he shouted, "they can't see Tim at all. They simply can't see fairies." But that was too much for Aunt Augusta. Even if these were ministers' children, and in their Sunday clothes. "Stop pretending this minute," she commanded, "and run along home. Dolores, you must come right into the house and lie down to get over this excitement. Fairies indeed." So it was 3 crestfallen children who went straggling down the hill toward Miss Sullivan's house on the way back to the parsonage. "We'll play with Mary and Billy now," said Robin. "They saw him fast enough." But Miss Sullivan, when they stopped at the gate, told them that Mary and Billy had been so disappointed to lose the chance of playing with the fairy that she had let them go down to the river with their Uncle Tom, who had happened by. Such a nice, jolly, well-mannered fairy, too, she admired, nodding in a friendly way to Fairy Tim in Beth's pocket. "It's sorry I am the children aren't here." Beth and Robin were sorry too, but Fairy Tim laughed. "Cheer up," he comforted them. "There's always tomorrow." Chapter 3. Fairy Tim is made to feel at home. And now the children decided that it was time to take Fairy Tim home and make him comfortable, for if he was to stay with them for some time, as he had promised, he must have a bed and a place in the house. What would Mother and Father say to a fairy in the house? Would they mind? The children did not think so, but perhaps they won't be able to see me at all. Perhaps they will tell you to stop pretending, the way Dolores's aunt did, said Fairy Tim. The children laughed at that. Not they assured him. And Beth said, "They may not see you, but they won't mind our seeing you. They are like that." Fairy Tim was glad, and it happened just that way. Mother Denning and Father Denning could not see Fairy Tim at all, though they looked right at him, trying hard enough to see. When the children pointed, he was standing on Baby Paul's shoulder, and Baby Paul was holding him steady by clasping his ankles with one chubby hand. "Go on pretending as much as ever you like, children," Father Denning said. smiling, after he had looked and seen nothing. And who knows, he whispered softly into Mother Denning's ear, that it is all pretending, and that the children haven't a fairy there that our duller eyes can't see. Mother Denning, who was sensible, laughed quietly at that, but said nothing. So the children scurried around to find a bed for the fairy and a place to put him. A shoebox proved to be just the thing, and they decided to fill it up to the top with fresh grass every night, for Fairy Tim thought that pillows and covers might be too stuffy and give him bad dreams. Beth wanted to treat him like a doll, dress and undress him, make day clothes and night clothes, and put him to live in the doll's house, in the nursery. But Robin knew better than that. He doesn't want to be stuffy and stodgy like your old dolls, he cried. Silly. And besides, since Mother and Father can't see him at all, when you got him dressed up in everyday doll's clothes, they'd have a fit, wouldn't they? Beth did not understand. Why, explained Robin, can't you see how funny it would be for them to see empty doll's clothes walking and running around and jumping up onto baby Paul's shoulder? They'd have a fit, I say. Yes, Robin was thoughtful, and could always see ahead about a thing like that. Beth gave in, and Fairy Tim clapped his hands. He had been beginning to think about giving up missionary work and going back through the Buttercup door to his own land, if he was to be made to live a doll's life. At last, all was arranged. Tim was to sleep in a shoe box on the foot of baby Paul's crib. Baby Paul was always the first to wake in the morning, and it was only fair that he should have Fairy Tim to play with then, since Beth and Robin were sure to be asleep anyway, and never miss him. At the table he was to sit by Robin's plate, perched on the edge of Robin's milk glass, and share his milk. All fairies like milk when it is sweet and warm. And strange to say, Mother Denning, when the children asked if the fairy might do this, seemed pleased and said, "Yes, indeed." The children were astonished at her answer, for wasn't she always urging Robin to finish his milk, even though he didn't like or want it? And now she said the fairy might have it. Strange mother. Hurrah, cried Robin. But Beth, now that was settled, was troubled about clothes. You can't sleep in your day clothes very well, she told Fairy Tim, and you must have changes at least once a week. Fairy Tim looked much surprised at that. But of course, no respectable fairy, and especially a missionary, would sleep in his day clothes, he assured her. And you must know I change every day in the week, say nothing of once a week. But how can you? Asked Beth. You didn't bring any suitcase through the door of the Buttercup. Fairy Tim laughed at that, until it seemed that Mother, reading by the window, must hear him, and see that he was really truly true. But she did not lift her eyes from her book. Suitcase, of course not. It is the day itself that attends to my changes. When I have had a jolly day, say, a very jolly day, the morning after, I wake up all in a crimson suit. If the day before was quiet but happy, I wake up in blue. If it was stupid, and I got stupid with it, my dress is brown. So my days make the clothes, and in a month's time you will see that I have been through all the colors of the rainbow. My cape, of course, is always the same, the color of daylight. That's why, when people manage to see fairies at all, it is usually at night. A piece of daylight in the night is hard to overlook. What fun to have your days make your clothes, exclaimed Beth, who had listened wide-eyed. I wish mine would make mine. Then I wouldn't have to wear blue-checked gingham every day in the week. I do get so tired of it. Tim laughed. Your days make you, he said, and that is even more fun, I should say. A fairy is always a fairy, and the same fairy, but you are a growing up little girl. Every morning you wake up different, made so from the day before. Robin nodded his head, for he understood about that, even though he was only 6. But Beth puzzled over it for a long time, and even at the end of the puzzling did not quite understand, though she was all of 8. But though Beth did not understand exactly, she was sensible enough to see that Fairy Tim knew what he was talking about, so she dropped the question of clothes. By this time it was bedtime, and the children scampered off to the nursery more readily than Mother had ever seen them. But of course what they wanted was to get to sleep just as soon as they could, so that another day might begin. Think of going to sleep with the thought that you will wake up in the morning with a fairy in the house, that he will be around all day to play with, to share your meals, even to take to school in your pocket. What may not happen to the 3 children who have a fairy, a real fairy, for a playmate? In fact, after Beth and Robin were snuggled up in their beds, out on the sleeping porch, the very thought of the fairy and tomorrow kept them awake. It isn't fair that Baby should have him quite to himself, said Robin, suddenly sitting up in his bed, and they're not making a sound. Let's steal into Mother's room and see what they are up to in there, so quiet and all. Baby Paul slept in a crib at the foot of Mother Denning's bed. After he was put to bed, it was his habit to talk and laugh to himself for many minutes before sleep came. But tonight, strange to say, all was quiet. Beth and Robin crept out of their beds and went tiptoeing on their bare feet into the big quiet room, where the corners were lost in the dusk. This was not allowed, of course, but they forgot that, because of their excitement. Not a sound, and when they got to the crib, there was Baby Paul fast asleep, his chubby arms thrown up above his head, his yellow, curling eyelashes shut down tight on his soft cheeks. As for Fairy Tim, he too was fast asleep, wrapped in his daylight cloak, on the top of the grass in the shoe box at the foot of the crib. What a good fairy it was! But how could Mother, when she came to bed later, help but see that scrap of daylight at the foot of the crib? Well, if she did see it, she never told. Strange Mother. Beth and Robin were hardly back in bed and asleep themselves before Fairy Tim came running along into their dreams. For that is one of the peculiar things about fairies. They can play with you in your dreams almost as well as when you are awake. Chapter 4. Following My Leader. Imagine the fun of going into your schoolroom some morning with a fairy, a real live fairy, sticking his head out of your pocket. That is what Beth did the next morning. Robin was close at her side, his eyes sparkling. Fairy Tim himself was rather excited, bobbing about, leaning out over the edge, and smiling around at every one. But Beth was just demure. You might think she was in the habit of carrying a fairy in her pocket every day of the year. The first child to notice was Flora, a pale, quiet, new little girl, whose mother was the village dressmaker. Flora was sitting rather lonely at her desk, waiting for school to begin, not playing with the other children. And that is how she was the first to notice Beth and Robin as they came in. She gasped and then cried, "A fairy! Oh, a fairy!" And forgetting her shyness and strangeness, ran across to Beth, her face shining, and knelt on the floor by the pocket. And then all of the children saw, of course. At least, all of them who could see fairies at all saw Fairy Tim, bobbing about and smiling at them in friendly fashion over the top of Beth's pocket. At once Beth and Robin were at the center of a shouting, laughing, pushing circle. And just at that very minute, the 9 o'clock bell rang. Imagine having to leave a fairy because a bell has rung. The children couldn't imagine it, and still stayed, laughing, crowding, and even touching Fairy Tim. If Miss Jeremy, the teacher, had had a fairy seeing eyes, even then all might have been well, but unfortunately she hadn't. "All go to your seats," she called in a rather loud voice. Her voice simply had to be loud if it was to be heard over the shouts of delight, surprise, and wonder of the fairy-seeing children. And then, when all the children were in their seats, hands folded in front of them on their desks, shoulders back, feet square, she spoke again. "Beth Denning, come to the desk and place whatever it is you have in your pocket here by my inkwell." The children rustled with excitement as Beth walked quietly up the aisle and stood before the teacher. But before she could pick Fairy Tim from her pocket, out he had jumped of his own accord, and now stood on the top of the inkwell, his daylight cape flung back, his yellow tam-o'-shanter in his hand, as he made a polite and very sweeping bow to Miss Jeremy. That done, he sat down on the inkwell, facing her. How the children shouted with laughter! But since Miss Jeremy had seen nothing of all this, she only grew more serious. I said, Beth, to place whatever you have there in your pocket, here by the inkwell. I will keep it safely for you until school is over. But he jumped himself right up on to the inkwell, cried Beth. Miss Jeremy stared. Beth was one of her best pupils, always having at least a good on her deportment card. What had happened to her? Come around by me, Miss Jeremy said sternly. Beth went quickly around the corner of the desk, her blue, honest eyes wide open and looking into Miss Jeremy's eyes. Miss Jeremy bent and spread open Beth's pocket, peering carefully into it. Nothing there but a folded handkerchief. He's on your inkwell. Look, said Beth, pointing. Miss Jeremy did look sharply, but saw nothing at all on her inkwell. For a long minute it was so still in the schoolroom that all the waiting children at their desks began counting the clock ticks. At last Miss Jeremy, with a very puzzled face, told Beth to return to her seat, and school began. But think of sitting all morning in school with a fairy, and such a jolly fairy as Tim was, wandering around on your teacher's desk. It was not easy for the fairy-seeing children to put their minds on their lessons, you may be sure. But after a while, Fairy Tim, in his wanderings, was lost to them behind the big dictionary. There he stretched himself in the shade, and was sound asleep as soon as he was stretched. The truth is that he had been so busy running around in the children's dreams the night before that he had got very little real rest himself. This he thought was a good time to catch up. But even with Fairy Tim out of sight, I must admit that it was the children who couldn't see fairies. The non-fairy seers, as they afterward came to be called, who got good marks in their lessons that morning. The fairy-seeing children came out only fair, or even worse. When recess came at last, Beth went up to Miss Jeremy. "Please, may I have Tim now?" she asked. Miss Jeremy looked more perplexed than ever, but after a minute said she might, and Tim, who was never asleep when it was time to be awake, heard, and sprang lightly over the dictionary onto Beth's shoulder. Then, with all the fairy-seeing children crowding around her, Beth ran out to play. "Let's play Follow My Leader," cried Fairy Tim. "That is one of our best games, where I come from." It was one of the children's best games, too, and so the fun began. Fairy Tim, of course, was made the leader. Around the end of the schoolhouse he ran, his daylight cape fluttering back from his shoulders, until he was out of sight. All the fairy-seeing children rushed after him, up the little hill behind the schoolhouse, over the 3 stumps standing there in a row across the stone wall, through the stream. Ouch, wet feet. Back again the same way, under the schoolhouse steps, across the road, over the bars, into the cow pasture, in and out among the great staring cows, over into the far corner of the pasture, up onto the barbed wire fence, there, and then up the big oak tree, almost to the very tip, went Fairy Tim, and stayed there, leaning against a spray of leaves. All the fairy-seeing children had managed to follow him up the hill behind the schoolhouse and back to the steps, that is, all except little Peter, who had fallen into a pool in the stream. Then Lucy, a plump little girl, had stuck at the steps and had to be pulled out backward by a non-fairy seer. And when they came to the climb over the bars into the cow pasture, all the remaining fairy-seeing girls, save Mary Sullivan and that strange new little girl, stayed behind. Some of the cows had such sharp-looking horns, and they all had a peculiar way of eyeing intruders. By the time the barbed wire fence was reached, only 3 boys were left, Billy Sullivan, Robin, and another. But that strange, new little girl, Flora, was still following. The children who had stayed back by the bars and were now watching could hardly believe their eyes. Up into the limbs of the giant oak struggled and scrambled the 3 brave boys, but Flora was before them, and she alone was finally able to reach the top, where Fairy Tim waited against his spray of leaves. What a hand-clapping and shouting reached her from the children back at the bars, and from the 3 boys now down under the tree. Her pale cheeks flushed with pleasure, but she was too shy to wave and call back. Besides, she needed both her hands. And look, Fairy Tim had left his leaves and jumped to her shoulder, where he stood laughing and waving for her while she slowly scrambled backward down the great oak. When she got to the bars, all could see that the strange, new little girl was stained and dirty, her legs spotted with black and blue, and one of her long, smooth pigtails unbraided and blowing, but her face was shining with victory. Miss Jeremy, watching from the school door, where she had come with the bell in her hand, stood quietly, looking more puzzled than ever, and the non-fairy-seeing children, standing to watch too, were dumb with amazement. What was it all about anyway? They couldn't tell you. After school that morning, Miss Jeremy kept Robin and Beth back for a minute. "Will you please," she said, smiling a little strangely, "leave your fairy at home tomorrow? Your little brother might like to play with him, and school isn't just the place for a fairy anyway." "But it was fun having him there, wasn't it?" said Beth as they wandered toward home. "I should say," agreed Robin, "and it was fun too, to find out about Flora. and we'd all been laughing at her and calling her Scare Cat. Think of it. Chapter 5. The Fairy Seers Form a Club. Now among the non-fairy seeing children at the school there was big, curly-headed Dick Barnes, the oldest of them all, and large for his age. He was a great tease, and once Miss Jeremy, Beth, had heard it, had called him a bully. This morning Dick had laughed loudly at the very idea of a fairy in Beth's pocket. He was sure that only silly girls and babyish boys could believe in fairies. In fact, he made so much fun of Fairy Tim, whom he couldn't see, that some of the fairy-seeing children began to be a little ashamed of their seeing eyes. But in spite of that, none of them could keep away from the parsonage that afternoon, where Fairy Tim was living. You would have thought there was a children's party at the parsonage for all the fairy-seeing children of the school. 5 of them were there with Beth and Robin and baby Paul. Out in the corner of the lawn under the big maple, sitting in a circle around Fairy Tim, who was perched Turk-wise on a grass mound. Lucy, you remember the plump little girl who got stuck under the steps, was saying, "I almost didn't get here at all. That Dick Barnes was waiting at the corner of Elm Street when I came out of the house, but I saw him before he saw me and ran around through the lane. He got fooled that time." "What would he have done to you?" asked Beth. "He pulled my hair," cried Mary Sullivan, "and jammed a great big green caterpillar into my pocket. He called it a fairy named Just Pretend." Flora laughed. "He did the very same thing to me," she said in a quiet voice. "I brought the caterpillar with me. Here it is," and she opened her hand. "Isn't it a beauty? I wouldn't give it back, though he teased hard enough." "What are you going to do with it?" Lucy asked, shrinking away as far as she could. "Let it crawl away and make its cocoon, just as it wants to, poor fellow," Flora answered. "I guess you surprised Dick," Billy said admiringly. "Yes, he was surprised, but it's horrid to have your hair pulled just the same." "He called me a sissy," growled Ted. Ted was one of the boys who had got almost to the top of the oak when Fairy Tim was the leader. "Only sissies talk about fairies," he said. "Shh! There he is," whispered Beth. "Let's pretend we don't see him." For Dick Barnes was sauntering along by the fence, 2 other non-fairy seeing boys trailing after. They spied the children under the maple at that minute, and stopped to lean against the gate post and stare. "Oh dear, I'm almost afraid. They're such horrid boys," whispered Lucy. "Nonsense," hissed Robin, sensibly if not very politely. "That's just what they want us to be, afraid of 'em." "I say, cried Fairy Tim, suddenly leaping up onto Beth's shoulder, so as to be more on a level with the fairy-seeing eyes of the children. Let's start a club. Any one of you alone may well be afraid of that great, big, blind as a bat, curly-headed fellow. I don't blame you for that. But if we form a club, and promise to protect each other, and plan to get the best of him, I guess it's Dick Barnes who will be afraid of us. Hurrah! Let's! Cried Ted. And Robin and all the others cried, hurrah too. For clubs are always such fun. And besides, to have a club with a real live fairy in it, how exciting. Oh, let's. And what shall we call it? They all began talking at once. But they had forgotten how near those big boys were out there by the gate, and now they had overheard the word club. They at once began to laugh. Go on, infants. Get up a club. Do, they called softly. Careful that no grown-ups should hear their teasing. Well, get up a club too, right away, so just watch out. The fairy seers, under the maple, pretended not to hear, but crowded together in a very close circle indeed. All the rest of their plans were whispered. Only Fairy Tim spoke in his natural voice, for of course the big boys would not hear him, even if he should shout. They quickly decided to call themselves the Fairy Seers. Fairy Tim at once and unanimously was voted president. Every child at some time or other has belonged to a club, but what other children have ever had a fairy for a president? The badge and sign of the club was to be a buttercup, either real, painted, or embroidered. Every fairy seer must make or get his own badge for himself, and always wear it. But now the big boys by the gate grew tired of trying to overhear what was not intended for them to hear. They again began calling softly. Exactly what they said the children could not make out, but it was something about infants and clubs and sissies. Robin and Ted and Billy stood up, very red-cheeked, and faced them. But just then the big boys turned away and ran, laughing and shouting to one another, down the street. Fairy Tim looked after them from his high place on Beth's shoulder. It will be fun doing missionary work here, with such boys to convert, he exclaimed. What are you going to convert them to? Asked Robin, puzzled. Why, fairy truth, of course, said Fairy Tim. But how can you ever, when they can't even hear you? Wondered Robin. Wait and see, advised Fairy Tim, nodding wisely. But meanwhile, said Beth, they won't leave us alone. They've gone off now to plan some way to bother us. And they do think up the hortiest and most scary things, sighed Lucy. Where have they gone to make these plans? Asked Fairy Tim. Oh, up in Dick's barn, probably, said Robin. That's where they have all their meetings, when they're planning revenges. Revenges was Robin's word for the practical jokes these big boys were forever playing on the younger children in the school. Remember the time they spoiled Beth's birthday party? All the fairy seers did remember it very well, and at the memory they shuddered a little. But Fairy Tim, their president, did not shudder. "Let's not make any more plans for our club," he said, "until we have learned something about their plans. The thing for us to do is to find out what they are up to, and then surprise them at it." "That's just it," sighed Beth. "If we ever could know what they're up to, it would be great fun, but they are as secret as can be." "Yes, of course," said Tim. "But now you have a fairy on your side, remember. Just tell me where this meeting place of theirs is, and I'll run along there this minute, and be back here in a twinkling with all the news." The fairy seers stared. Then they burst into gleeful laughter. The non-fairy seeing children would be the only ones Dick could get together for his plans, since all the fairy seers were here. To the others, Fairy Tim would be no more than a buttercup mixed with the hay. Hurrah, hooray! Excitedly, they gave him directions down the street, across Elm, and then up the ladder at the back of the red barn, behind the gray house, with the morning glories growing by the doorstep. Fairy Tim was away almost before they had finished, but as he ran, this song floated lightly back to the children. "Blind eyes never mean nothing's there to be seen, not to see what's about." The last verse they did not catch, but it did not really matter, for this time Fairy Tim was not singing his fairy truth at them, but at the big, curly-headed boy, who, worse luck for him, would never even hear it. The new club clapped its hands and laughed delightedly. Then it settled down to wait until Fairy Tim should return with his news. Chapter 6. Miss Angela Sees the Fairy. Fairy Tim was so long in bringing his news that the children began to be afraid, almost, that he would never return, but had gone back to his own land through the Buttercup door. They were ever so glad and relieved then, when at last they heard his light voice singing over the grass blades, the same song he had sung on going. "And blind eyes never mean nothing's there to be seen." He was laughing when he settled down turquoise on the grass mound among them. Tell us quickly," Beth cried eagerly. "Well, they have formed a club, just as we thought. All the non-fairy-seeing children of the school are in it. They were gathered up there in the hay loft, and Dick is their president. He didn't know that your president was sitting just over his head." Here Fairy Tim had to stop to laugh, and all the fairy seers laughed with him, though they were impatient for him to go on with the story. They call themselves the big six, because there are 6 of them, and they are all bigger than you, I suppose. But what are they going to do to us? Asked Lucy nervously. It's a wonderful scheme, answered Fairy Tim. Dick is going to school early tomorrow, in time to slip a note into Beth's desk. It will be written on a tiny square of note paper, in the very tiniest writing, in red ink. It will read, "Dear Beth, you and your friends are invited to a dance tonight in Miss Angela's garden by the fountain when the moon comes up. Refreshments. Yours truly, the Fairies." The children stared, but they don't believe in fairies, they said. Of course they don't, laughed Fairy Tim. That is their joke, you see. They know that you do, though, and they think that this will be a fine way to get you into Miss Angela's garden. While you are there, waiting for the fairies, which the big 6, of course, think will never come, they will climb onto the wall and throw horse chestnuts at Miss Angela's parlor windows. They are sure that Miss Angela and her servant will rush out and catch you there. Perhaps Miss Angela will even call up the police. Then the big 6 think they would have fun. How good that you found it all out, gasped Beth, and how fooled they will be not to find us there. All the children began to laugh. Oh, I know something more fun than that, cried Flora, her eyes sparkling. Her shyness was quite forgotten in the presence of Fairy Tim. Let's tell Miss Angela all about it, and get her to let us have a party there. A real party, when the moon comes up. Think what fun it would be to have the big 6 watching on the wall, and us having a real party. Oh, but you don't know Miss Angela, gasped Beth, horrified. She never would let us even go into her garden. She's dreadful. Why? Asked Flora, who had been so short a time in the village that she had not heard of Miss Angela before. She is a dreadful old lady who lives all alone with a great, ugly, cross giant of a servant, explained Beth. They both just hate children, and there are no trespassing signs stuck up all around the yard and garden. The wall is stone and built high, just to keep children and animals out. And in the house and on the porch there are police bells, Dick says, so that she can catch anyone who comes near her old place. If Miss Angela sees you on the street, she just turns away her head. But if the cross giant of a servant sees you, she frowns at you until you just have to run the other way. Flora and Fairy Tim looked at each other. Flora was a child who could read fairy thoughts. That is why she now said, to the other children's amazement, I will go and tell her about the big 6 just the same, and all about their plans. Perhaps she isn't so horrid as you think. Perhaps she will let us have a party in her garden after all. And I'll go with you, cried Fairy Tim, springing to her shoulder. The fairy seers stared at Flora in admiration. What a brave child she was! But Beth did not mean to let Flora go off with her fairy in that cool way. "I'm going too," she said bravely. "Hurrah!" cried Fairy Tim. Miss Angela was in her garden, sitting by the edge of the little fountain there, feeding her goldfish. She was a little old lady with soft, silvery hair and rose-leaf cheeks, dressed all in gray with a tiny bow of cherry ribbon on her breast. When she saw the children coming over the grass past her no trespassing sign, she jumped up and went hurrying toward the house, but Flora called to her, "Oh, please, Miss Angela, we want to speak to you about something, if you don't mind." So Miss Angela stood still in the middle of the lawn and waited for them. Her eyes were a dim, soft blue. How could anyone be afraid of such a gentle little lady? Wondered Flora. And even Beth was thinking the same thing. For to tell the truth, no child for many years had been close enough to those eyes to see their gentleness. It was easy enough now to tell Miss Angela their story. She listened earnestly and then went back to the fountain again. The two girls sat on the grass at her feet. "But why are all the children afraid of me?" wondered Miss Angela, puzzled. "I didn't know they were afraid of a lonely old woman like me. I thought they didn't like me, that was all." It was then that Fairy Tim, who was on Beth's shoulder now, whispered into Beth's ear, "You see, Miss Angela was afraid of you children, more afraid than you were of her." But Miss Angela, to their surprise, had heard Fairy Tim's voice. She leaned forward and stared hard at Beth's shoulder. "What is that?" she asked tremulously. Beth jumped up. "Oh, Miss Angela, can you see him? How jolly!" "No, I can't quite see him," said Miss Angela, puzzled. "But I almost see something. A tiny young boy, a fairy in a daylight cloak, perched on your shoulder. He comes and goes in my eyes like light. There he is again." How wonderful that Miss Angela, of all people, should be a fairy seer. "How glad we are," said Flora. "Why, you must join the club, the Fairy Seers." "But I have to put my mind on it to see," said Miss Angela, pleased but modest. "If I forget to keep my mind on him, off he goes, and nothing's there but daylight." "Why, even my father can't see him, no matter how much he puts his mind on it," Beth told her. The children were delighted with Miss Angela, and Miss Angela herself was very happy. In just a few minutes she had made friends with 2 children and a fairy thrown in. "We shall have real ice cream at the party," she promised, "and Martha was the giant of a servant. Martha will make angel cake. The big 6 may watch all they like from the wall." Beth and Flora clapped their hands. "And may I ask some of my fairy friends?" begged Fairy Tim. "Perhaps they can find their way through those tulips by the walk. We will dance in a real fairy ring for you, and you may dance too, if you will only be careful where your feet come down." Now even Miss Angela clapped her hands. "Think of fairies and children having a party in my garden," she whispered to herself. "And let's make tiny paper lanterns," cried Flora. "My mother taught me how. Tiny colored lanterns with birthday candles in them. We can string them between the tulips and around the fairy ring." "Hurrah!" cried Fairy Tim. "The Big Six will think they are dreaming." Then they said goodbye and ran home as fast as they could to tell the other fairy seers about Miss Angela's plan. Chapter 7. A Party by Moonlight. The next morning, when Beth opened up the tiny folded piece of notepaper that she found lying on top of the books in her desk, all the Big Six crouched down in their seats as far as they could and hid behind their books. And when, at recess, they saw all the fairy seers over by the cow pasture bars, standing together in a close circle, whispering and laughing, they went around behind the schoolhouse to whisper and laugh too. Anyone could see, they agreed, that the fairy seers were taking the invitation seriously. What they could not see, though, was that a tiny young boy, wrapped round and round in a daylight cloak, was sitting astride the topmost bar and laughing heartily. If they had seen Fairy Tim, and if they had heard his laughter, they certainly would have suspected enough to change their plans. Before the moon rose that night, the Big Six met in Dick's father's hayloft. From the open hayloft door, in the twilight, they watched Beth and Robin and the other fairy seers stealing softly down the street toward Miss Angela's house on the corner. "They are going early," whispered Dick, as well as he could, for smothered laughter couldn't wait for the moon. They were easy. Soon after, just as the rim of the moon came into the night sky, the Big Six stole down the ladder and quietly around through the lane to the back of Miss Angela's house. There they got down on their hands and knees and crept around the wall to the side where the garden and fountain were. They listened a while before climbing upon the wall, but not a sound did they hear. "Of course," whispered Dick, "they are scared to death of Miss Angela and her big servant, but they expect the fairies just the same." Suddenly, out of the stillness over the wall in the garden, they heard a tinkling laugh. "What was that?" whispered Max, one of the Big Six, startled. "It didn't sound like human laughter, almost like a fairy." "Fairies," hissed Dick scornfully. "That's Flora, that new girl. She would laugh anywhere. Nothing could scare her. But now that we know they're there all right, let's climb up." So up they scrambled to the top of the high wall, and there they lay, staring, gasping, wriggling at the sight that met their surprised eyes, but perfectly silent for all that. Dick's lips, it is true, puckered themselves for an amazed whistle, but he stopped it just in time. The moon was quite bright now, and all the garden was as clear as day beneath them. In and out among the tulips were strung rows of tiny colored lanterns, with a tiny candle glowing in every one, and the same tiny lanterns made a circle on the lawn, close to the fountain. Around the circle, on their knees, in the dewy grass, in spite of their party clothes, knelt the fairy seers. Even baby Paul was there, snuggled against Beth's side. What the big six could not see, of course, was the band of fairies, who, just as Tim had promised, had been able to come to the children through the tulips, dancing to fairy music, round and round the ring under the lanterns. The fairy seers themselves had to put their minds on it to see these new fairies, for as Miss Angela had said about Tim, the fairies came and went before your eyes like light, but by keeping quite still and looking hard, every single fairy seer there saw the tulip fairies, almost all the first time. That is why they had been so silent. But now that Flora had laughed, it seemed easier to see. The fairy music stopped, and the fairies came running to gather around baby Paul. They ran lightly up and down his body, nestling in his soft curly hair, laughing in his neck, cuddling into his hands, for fairies love babies, and when they once have found one, will not leave him alone. It was just at this minute that Miss Angela's door opened. The boys on the wall, in their surprise at the lanterns and the fairy seers' queer actions, had forgotten to throw their horse chestnuts. But surely Miss Angela must have heard Flora laughing, they thought, and now she would catch the children in her garden right under the no trespassing sign. The big six flattened themselves down on the top of the wall and watched delightedly. It was for this they had come. Should Miss Angela spy them, they could jump down, of course, and get away easily enough. Miss Angela's door had opened, I say, and she was coming down the steps. The boys on the wall could hardly believe their eyes. She was carrying a tall candle in one hand and holding up her silk skirts with the other, and behind her, towering above her, came the giant of a servant. But Martha, the servant, was not brandishing a rolling pin or shouting with rage. She looked as cross and as frightening as always, it is true, for poor Martha thought that this party of Miss Angela's was all foolishness, and she did not care who knew that she thought so. But for all that, she loved Miss Angela, and lived only to make her happy. That is why now she was meekly carrying a large tray in her hands. When she came nearer, under the wall, the big six could see plainly enough what was on the tray. A big bowl of ice cream, a plate of cakes with frosting, saucers, spoons, and all around the edge a row of candles. The fairy seers had jumped up to meet Miss Angela, but baby Paul got to her first. Even the boys on the wall could see a strange glow and sparkle about his little white dress and hair. Afterward, they agreed that it was the candlelight, but at the time each big six had thought to himself, fairies. Miss Angela, "Oh, wonderful!" put her candle down on the edge of the fountain, and sitting down by it, took baby Paul onto her lap. "I'm so glad your mother let you come," she said in a gay little old voice. Baby Paul snuggled closer and glimmered all the more. "But what are these tiny, tiny, tiny spoons and saucers for?" asked Lucy, on tiptoe beside Martha and the tray. "Why, for the fairies, of course. We can't expect them to eat from giant dishes like ours." The big six on the top of the wall almost tumbled off it right down into the garden in their amazement when they heard Miss Angela mention the fairies so casually. But now Fairy Tim was speaking, and of course they couldn't hear him. He was saying to Miss Angela, "You haven't seen us dance." "I want to, though, very much," Miss Angela answered. So all the fairies ran to the circle again, and Miss Angela followed. There, much to Martha's disgust, who was a non-seer, and the big six's astonishment, Miss Angela, all in her silks, knelt down in the dewy grass and looked steadily at the bright spot circled by the tiny lanterns. After a few minutes, during which the big six and Martha had heard or seen nothing, Miss Angela clapped her hands and laughed, and all the fairy seers laughed too. "Now may we dance with you, as you promised, Fairy Tim," cried Flora. And the next minute there were the fairy seers and Miss Angela, dancing lightly round and round, careful not to tread on the lanterns, and even more careful, could the big six have known, not to tread on other things. But this time the big six did hear something like music, far away and clear and high. Silly boys, not to guess that it was fairy music. By the time the ice cream was passed and the children had begun to eat it, the big six slipped down from the wall and away, out of the lane toward the hay loft. You could hardly expect them to watch those little children eating ice cream and cake with frosting on it at a party to which they had not been invited. "Was it a dream?" asked Max, truly doubtful, up in the hay. "No," answered Dick crossly, "but it was dreamish." "They just must have found out our plan and got even with us this way," said Max, almost admiringly. "They just must," agreed Dick scornfully. "So now's the time to get up a better plan." And the big six put their heads together to think up another plan to outwit the smaller children then and there. And this time Fairy Tim was not there to hear it.